So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Abby Gewirtz next. And Abby and Bravada are longtime sisters and colleagues. They may not look like it, but like Bravada, Abby has deep, deep credentials, and she can be a really fierce fighter when she needs to be. So she's going to talk about what we know about supporting parenting in families affected by stressful and traumatic events. Abby's the director of the Institute for Translational Research in Children's Mental Health and the Center for Resilient Families. She's a Lindahl Leadership Professor at the University of Minnesota's Department of Family Social Science. And she's editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Psychology. For over a decade, her research has been funded by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, and the Department of Defense. She's published and presented widely on parenting, trauma, and child adjustment. So Abby is also one of the many researchers that have been influenced by Marian Forgash and the PMTO model, which you've heard about. And she's the lead developer of ADAPT, After Deployment Adaptive Parenting Tools, which is a PMTO-based prevention intervention for military families. I think her most proud achievement is she's a mother of 4 children, as she mentioned. By the way, in case you didn't figure it out, Abby is not native to Minnesota, but we are trying very hard to teach her to speak clearly, to clean up her grammar, and to do a little better job with her Minnesota accent. So, Abby.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris. You can hear me? We're good, okay. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I just have to, I don't know if Bravada's gone. Oh no, you're there. Okay, so Bravada overcame many obstacles to be here today, and we're so grateful for that. And so she comes in after goodness knows what hardship this morning, and she looked like she really needed a break. So I said, Bravada, why don't I go first, and then you can like sit down? And she's like, I'm not going to follow you. Well, I said to her, how do you think I feel? I have to follow you now. So thank you for that really beautiful, beautiful talk. Sometime or other, these slides will come up, and I'm going to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about trauma and the impact of trauma on parenting and on how that affects parents being their kids' best teachers. And I was thinking as I was listening to all the presentations that from the commissioner on forwards, I think everyone has talked about parents being their kids' best teachers. And there are so many different ways to do it. And there are so many different contexts and cultures and hardships and assets that people experience as they parent. And as I think both of you pointed out, parents parent their kids for lifetimes. And through multiple different developmental stages, through different eras in our nation's history. And we're living in a particularly interesting era right now. I'm just going to stop with interesting. I've been really fortunate to work with some absolutely remarkable people, including, by the way, our team here today. They're amazing. And they're so amazing that all I had to do was show up today. So I want to give a shout out to Chris. And Chris did all the thank yous first thing this morning. I was going to do them at the end, but I was worried that I might forget someone or something. So I really want to give Chris a shout out for all this incredible organization and to our wonderful team. Woo! I also want to acknowledge our funders, and it's tough, as you pointed out, it's tough to get work funded. It's really hard. It's a difficult funding environment, and so we're very grateful to get funding from the National Institutes of Health and Substance Abuse Mental Health Health Services Administration, Department of Defense. But actually, you can never do work without families, without parents, without people who serve parents, without children of parents, all of whom teach and have taught me how really I should be doing my work. So all the families that we work with are really responsible for teaching us. And I also want to acknowledge just one more person who's in the audience, who's Anne Maston, who you maybe can wave. Everyone probably knows you anyway. So I already acknowledged Marion as an absolutely dear mentor, but what probably very few people know is that the reason I got to Marion is through Anne. We were sitting and chatting in the early 2000s, and she said to me, there's this great paper by this Forgatch and Degamo. And I went and read it, and that's how my partnership, my collaboration, mentorship from Marion started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about parenting and traumatic events, and how parenting might be affected by traumatic events. Mostly I'm going to talk about what skills strengthen parenting after trauma, because as a prevention scientist, I'm really interested in what we can do about things. And of course, we need to know what's wrong in order to know what to do about things, but I'm really going to focus on what to do about things. I'm going to talk a little bit about ADAPT, our After Deployment Adaptive Parenting Tools program, as an example of modifying PMTO, and in particular, modifying parent training, and in particular PMTO, for families affected by traumatic events. And in this example, the traumatic experiences are the traumatic experiences of parents who have gone to war, who have served our country in Iraq or Afghanistan. So let's start. I'm just going to sort of briefly talk a little bit, and I'm going to go broader than military for this part, about what happens when parents have experienced traumatic events. So in particular, how is parenting affected by a parent's exposure to traumatic stress? And what do we know about the impact of post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD symptoms on parenting? And of course, all of you, because all of you are in this field, know that when we say traumatic events, we include multiple kinds of events that threaten life or limb and a person's perception of bodily integrity. And they can be abuse and neglect and community violence and historical trauma and being deployed to war, and many kinds of events. I'm just going to give you one example. We finished a study of homeless families about, 7 years ago. And in that study, which was primarily focused on helping families in transitional and supportive housing to nurture resilient kids, we looked at exposure to violence in mothers in 152 families. And these were mothers all of whom had been homeless. 3/4 of the moms reported involvement in a relationship characterized by domestic violence. 65% of the moms reported that their kids had witnessed the domestic violence. And fully 1/3 of the mothers reported that their kids had witnessed at least 10 instances of domestic violence. And this was some work done by my then student, Laurel Davis. And as most of you know, mothers don't like to talk about the fact that their kids have witnessed violence, and so usually it's a very significant underestimate when parents talk about what their kids have witnessed. We also asked kids to report about their own exposure to traumatic events, and 98% of the kids in these families in Minneapolis, in the Twin Cities, reported exposure to at least one of the events that we gave them a list of. It was 20 or 21 events. Most common was 82% had seen someone being arrested, 68% had seen someone being beaten up, 60% reported yes to grown-ups in my home yell at each other, and 55% had heard guns being shot. Of the parents talked, more than half the parents said that someone close to my child has been incarcerated. Almost half had been separated from their child for more than a week, and that's not atypical separations, not a parent going on vacation. And 15% reported their child had been sexually molested or assaulted. And not surprisingly, there's a relationship between exposure to violence and adjustment. The more exposure to violence, the poorer kids do, the harder it is for kids. What was really interesting, and again, not surprising to practitioners, but sort of emphasizes what we're talking about, was that effective, positive parenting observed, not what parents told us, but what we saw, significantly predicted child adjustment. So the more effective you were as a parent, as a mother, 98% of these families that we work with were mother-only headed, that if you were more effective and more positive, your kids did better. And parenting also moderated the impact of exposure to violence on child adjustment. So that meant that effective parenting interrupted the typical association between exposure to violence and adjustment. So even if you'd been exposed to relatively high levels of violence, if you had an effective parent, that protected you, and the child was reported to be doing better. And so I think it's just sort of emphasizes to us how important parents are, and particularly in difficult traumatic situations. We did a study of over 600 dads who went off to Iraq to fight. And again, I don't think any of these data are surprising to clinicians, but the growth in PTSD, so worsening PTSD symptoms over the course of a year from being in Iraq. So we surveyed these dads when they were in the battlefield in Iraq. We did a lot of FedEx. I bet you didn't know that FedEx goes to Iraq, right? And then we surveyed them. They came home 6 weeks after the first assessment, and then we surveyed them another year later, so about 10.5 months after they came home. And worsening PTSD symptoms were associated with reports of more difficulties in parenting. Again, not surprising. So how does trauma impact parenting? And this is sort of culled from what we know about, mostly actually about parents who've been exposed to abuse and domestic violence and community violence and those kinds of traumatic events. And what we know, of course, is that trauma, exposure to especially many traumatic events, one path is to get PTSD, to get post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD symptoms. But trauma is also strongly associated with other kinds of problems like substance abuse, self-medication, depression, and anxiety. And parents, particularly those who have been through child welfare system as kids, who've been exposed to multiple incidents of violence in the home, and have experienced failure in school, for example, they feel disempowered. And this is especially true for those who then become adults who get into the child welfare system because of issues with their own children. And then sometimes what happens, and again, this is a clinical term, and so clinicians are quite familiar with this, parents, children of those parents sometimes become parentified. They end up looking after their parents because they're so sensitive to their parents' challenges, and then they end up being old beyond their years. What trauma does, and again, this is not rocket science, but the essence of trauma, of a traumatic experience, is something that is overwhelming to us. It renders us completely helpless. There is nothing in our control, and of course you don't have to think back more than a few days to think about Hurricanes Harvey and Irma and what havoc was wreaked in Texas and in Florida and beyond. Trauma dysregulates our capacity to manage our own emotions. And then what happens is, for people who experience multiple traumatic events and or have PTSD symptoms, reminders of the traumatic event trigger dysregulating experiences. So an example might be when a mother who has her own experiences, traumatic experiences of being separated from an abusive parent, is asked to come to an appointment in a child welfare office. That appointment the visual of seeing the child welfare office is a trauma reminder. And sometimes I think people say, I can't believe she behaved that way. It's not a great way to behave if you want to get your children back, or if you, well, when we experience trauma reminders, we do things, our brain is short-circuited, and sometimes that results in very difficult situations for parents, for people who've experienced trauma. Similarly, if you grew up in an unsafe or you experienced unsafe situations, sometimes you don't know what should be safe and what is safe. And therefore, it's hard to make judgments about safety and danger. And one example that I had was I was visited by a sergeant major one time, a woman who just retired from the military, and she was doing some volunteer outreach work. And she came into me and she was very frustrated, and she said to me, I've just come from a home where it was a hot summer's day, it was like 90 degrees outside, and I go in and there's these, she was visiting a veteran, a father, and there's these 5 kids under the age of 10, and they're all inside the house, this hot house, and the shades are down. And I said to the father, why don't you let your kids go out to play? It's a gorgeous day. We don't get many 90-degree days in Minnesota, right? Maybe it was 80 degrees, I don't know. And he said, I'm not letting my kids out to play. It's too dangerous. And she said, what's dangerous about it? And he said, well, the fire ants. And she said, fire ants? We don't have fire ants in Minnesota. They just come from California. And he said, well, it's not safe to play outside. And obviously, that was a reflection of his own experiences on his tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. And it was very hard for him to make appraisals of what's realistically safe and dangerous. Trust is a big issue, as many of you know, for people who've been traumatized. And trauma, we know, also piles up, right? It means that you're more vulnerable to other life stressors, like poverty, like lack of education, lack of social support. And lack of social support is one very good example, and there's a lot of research on PTSD that shows that social support is crucial in protecting people from PTSD in the first place, and also in their recovery from PTSD. So sometimes we see this pile up. Sometimes traumatized parents find it hard to talk about their strengths, have a lot of difficulty in managing children's behavior, because if you don't quite know where, the judgments are hard, then it's not surprising that behavior will be hard to manage, and have difficulty labeling children's emotions, because PTSD is an emotional disorder, and anyone who's been exposed to a terrible event knows that it kind of knocks out your emotional capacity. And then, as one way to deal with it, and I'll talk quite a bit more about this, it's easy it's better sometimes just to kind of push away the emotions, right? We call it experiential avoidance. And if you push away the emotions, and if you try not to think about them, and sometimes the avoidance extends to other things, not just emotions, but behaviors and things that remind you of the event, you feel a little bit safer, you're a little bit more in control, but in reality you're not, because those things seep in anyway. And actually, avoidance can cause problems of its own, and it's really a core feature, actually, of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so emotions are really hard to manage. Emotions in families are tough anyway, right? My dearly beloved and sadly departed colleague, Jim Snyder, whose daughter Liz is somewhere here, he used to say the family is the crucible for strong emotions. Anyone who's in a family knows that. You display emotions in a family that mostly you don't display outside. So it's particularly then challenging in the wake of trauma to deal with emotions in a family situation. So I became really interested in PMTO a long time ago, and my interest really was in seeing what we could do to strengthen, to help families in which parents and or children had been exposed to traumatic experiences. And what we hypothesized, what we thought was that traumatic events probably disrupt parenting, mostly because they disrupt parents' ability to socialize their children's emotions. And learning about emotions isn't something we do in school. Now we have those lovely posters that show pictures of faces, but mostly, even in, in many families, emotions aren't something that is really a sort of ready thing that we learn how to do. We don't learn how to parent anyway. But to talk about your emotions is not an obvious thing to do. So what we were thinking happens is that in families where parents have been affected by trauma, we would expect even less discussion of emotions, that it would be harder for parents to respond to their children's negative emotions because it might be quite triggering for them when kids cry or yell or scream, and that it would be harder for children to witness effective emotion regulation in their parents because emotion regulation is what's disrupted when parents are traumatized. And so what we thought might happen, and I mentioned my colleague Jim Snyder because he always sort of painted this lovely picture in his papers of what he would call bids for attention, where you would have, say, a traumatized dad, and he would withdraw, particularly when things were going to be conflictual, because that's really scary when you're traumatized and you see high emotions coming your way. And so he would withdraw, and mom, who's trying to deal with these hot emotions, with the kids not wanting to do something or the kids fighting, she would be frustrated, and she would go to dad and she'd like, sort of help out, come on. And he would withdraw more, and she would nudge more, and then you can imagine what would happen. Boom, there's a big explosion. And so navigating this is quite tricky in families. And we also felt that it would be right, this kind of situation could be really ripe for an increase in coercive parenting, which is the connection to PMTO. We did a study in a domestic violence shelter a long time ago, must be 10, 12 years ago, where we brought in moms who were either in the shelter or who had just put out an order of protection against a partner who had been abusive to them, where the child had witnessed the abusive incident. And we followed these moms over a short time period, a few months, but over 3 time points, and we videotaped them with their kids. And not surprisingly, but no one had shown this before, coding the tapes in the same way that Marion talked about, what we found were that moms who were more effective and positive with their kids in the week of the incident, so right in the wake of that violent incident, had kids who were recovered from the traumatic event in terms of anxiety much quicker. So these were kids who really returned to baseline much quicker, kids who had effective parents. So PMTO, Marion talked about the history of PMTO, and Jerry Patterson and her interest in helping parents be their kids' best teachers to protect kids from the sort of difficult trajectories of antisocial behavior and behavior problems. And I was really interested in understanding what we could do for families who'd been affected by trauma. And so I'm going to give you one example, which is, and so we've done some work with families affected by domestic violence and homelessness, and also Somali and Oromo refugee and immigrant families. But most of the work recently has been done with a group of families who I think really have been largely briefly celebrated and largely forgotten, and those are the families who have served our country in the very, very long, more than a decade, almost 2 decades now of war, and those are the families who have a parent who has been deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan. And some of you may know we have a large National Guard, but we have no active duty bases in Minnesota, and the estimate is that we have deployed as many as 30,000 individuals from Minnesota to Iraq and Afghanistan, and now also to Syria and Jordan. And we were really interested in seeing what we could do to support the families from Minnesota. And so we developed ADAPT, which turned out to be the first evidence-based parenting program designed specifically for military families with school-aged kids. And we're really thrilled, I'll talk a little bit later about this, but we're really thrilled that the military has become more interested, and we now have studies in the active duty and around the country. So ADAPT is now a program. We started it in 2010. It's now a program that's available in multiple formats. The original program was 14 weeks group-based parenting program. We have an online self-directed format, an individual telehealth version, and I'll actually play you a story of a guy who participated in that, and we have a workshop format that we're developing now in our new study for families, where families actually in the regular army, active duty and special forces, special operations, those are the guys who continue to deploy very, very frequently, very often. It's incredibly disruptive to families' lives. It's really a tough place to be. The idea behind ADAPT is that parenting practices mediate the impact of family stresses on child adjustment by increasing coercive parenting, and Marion spoke so beautifully about that. I'm not going to go on, but the idea is that you should know that military families are resilient like any other civilian family, and that kids in military families, there's lots of research, do the same as anyone else. Deployment, though, the prolonged separation from a parent who is serving his or her country, who is in harm's way, and who is gone for any time from 4 months to 22 months at one time, is disruptive. And it's really hard for kids. And it's really hard for parents who are gone and for parents who come. And so we conceptualize deployment as a family stressor, and reintegration as a key opportunity to be able to really help parenting. So what we did was we augmented the PMTO framework by addressing in particular the things that I was talking about, emotion, socialization. On the assumption that a minority, but not an insignificant minority of parents, would come back from deployment with some measure of post-traumatic stress symptoms, what we call combat stress. We wanted to provide opportunities to give tools to parents to strengthen their capacity to regulate their own emotions in the face of traumatic reminders, to strengthen their kids' emotions by helping them figure out how they could help their kids. And we know that the issues are interesting. I was chatting with Marion about this a couple days ago. For our families, the challenge isn't so much that kids display out-of-control behavior. The problem is that kids are so highly anxious when parents are deployed, especially in Minnesota, where our families are very isolated. They don't live on a base where they go to school with other military kids. Often they're the only military kids in their school, certainly in their class. No one really understands what their parents are going through, what they're going through, and that's very anxiety-focused. Some families don't want to talk about it. So we wanted to find ways to help deal with kids' anxiety in the wake of this. And so what we did was, to the key PMTO contents, teaching through encouragement, effective discipline, family problem solving, positive involvement, and monitoring, we added emotion coaching for parents, so how to coach your children's emotions, and mindfulness component to help parents strengthen their own emotion regulation. And so we have these 6 key parenting skills, and the groups, and I think you talked about this, but the groups are very, very active. This is a behavior change intervention. So the groups consist of practice, role play, discussion, home practice, where parents go home and they practice the skills and they monitor their practice. And we also had an online sort of added online resources that included things like videos of skills, and I'm about to show you one, and mindfulness practices that you could download. And now we have an app, thanks to one of my students, and I'll show you a little bit about that later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you just one of the short videos, just to give you a little bit of a sense of this focus on emotions. So I think I have to press the, let's see if I can do this. Yeah.
Recognizing emotions is a key parenting tool. Emotions play a big role in family life. Communicating positive feelings strengthens family relationships. It's harder to parent, to give encouragement and effective directions, or to teach new skills when uncontrolled, negative feelings spill out and take over.
Will you guys knock it off and settle down? I'm trying to concentrate.
For children, intense negative emotions can be confusing and scary. Intense negative emotions like frustration, hopelessness, anxiety, and anger are triggered by stress. People cope with stress and difficult emotions in different ways. One way is to vent.
Come on, guys, turn it down in there.
Now we can play in your room.
And I cannot believe how much money you put on these credit cards.
So it's all me, is it? What about that fishing trip you took with your buddies? How much did you drop on that?
Every day I go to work to earn money for this family. I think I deserve a break now and then.
What, like I'm just sitting around here doing my nails all day?
Turn the damn TV down!
Venting can intensify negative feelings and escalate conflict. Another way people cope with stress and difficult emotions is by trying to escape them.
The two suicide car bombers detonated near simultaneously outside the house of the governor of Diwania south of Baghdad on Tuesday morning, yet again underscoring the fragility of the security situation in Iraq and raising questions about the ability of Iraq's security forces to maintain.
Trying to escape negative thoughts and feelings doesn't make them go away.
At a very critical
Mom?
Not now, sweetie.
This escape route disengages us from ourselves and others.
What these parents are experiencing is perfectly understandable. These are natural responses to stress or trauma. But negative thoughts and feelings don't have to control us or direct our behavior. The solution isn't to try to control your thoughts and feelings, but to recognize them.
Feelings are hard to control.
I feel guilty I wasn't there
Why
for
won't my
that.
kids behave?
My daughter's angry.
Her son doesn't listen. Faucet is dripping.
They happen automatically, all the time. When encountering feelings that are uncomfortable, it's normal to try to shake them off. But this struggle with negative feelings can heighten discomfort. Instead of trying to resist negative thoughts and feelings, we can simply recognize them. Notice thoughts and feelings as they come up. Noticing means just observing, not trying to resist, react, or do anything about them. Noticing instead of struggling allows the thoughts and feelings to pass through.
When you take time to recognize your emotions, you'll discover that you struggle less, feel less tension, and are able to act without being at the mercy of negative thoughts and feelings.
Set aside a short amount of time each day to be aware of yourself and the world around you. Focus on simple things like the sounds you hear, the ground under your feet, your breathing, or the feeling of your body in your clothes. This awareness helps you observe your thoughts and feelings without being overtaken by them. When you observe a feeling, tell yourself that you're noticing it. You don't need to react to it right away. Like the cars passing by, your feelings and thoughts will come and go. By practicing this simple exercise, you may notice that you feel better. You may notice that your problems seem less threatening.
Hey, little man.
Hey, how was your walk?
It's good.
Want to go see the fort I built in the backyard?
Yeah, let's go see it.
You may notice that you're able to act in a calm, matter-of-fact way, from a position of strength and stability. You can download a
I think you got the idea. It's easy to, looks really easy, doesn't it? You know, you just say it and people will do it. But of course, behavior change is harder than that. And so we spend a significant part of every session, and we talk a little bit about mindfulness being like an exercise. We actually don't use the M word. We call these noticing exercises. And the idea is to help parents be present. And, you know, if you take a walk and you take time to look around and notice and breathe and be present, then you're more likely to be available to your children as well, and to be present for them too, and to be a stronger parent. And so one of the loveliest things I ever heard at the end of the group, when the families were talking about what they'd learned and how they'd changed things, one guy, he was a particularly tough guy, he said, I don't go for a run with my headphones anymore. I leave my iPhone at home, and I run, and I'm aware of what's outside, and it was lovely. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about the data. Sorry, have to talk data. And so I'll just tell you about our findings, and particularly our findings around the emotional piece. So we spent 6 years on this study. We recruited 336 families with 608 adults and 336 kids, and we followed them for 2 years. And the families were randomly assigned, flip of a coin, to either be invited to participate in the ADAPT groups or to other parenting resources, including online and print resources. And we really sort of built on the goodwill of our military families to share learnings. And we went into their homes at baseline 1 year and 2 years, and we spent over 3 hours with them. And our wonderful team is here, our ADAPT team. And they were sort of, really, we attached heart rate monitors to parents, and we videotaped them, and we swabbed the inside of their cheeks, and we had them do these really boring tests to get executive functioning and IQ data, and we had parents and kids talk to each other, and we asked a lot of questions. What we were really interested in, obviously, was we wanted to know whether the program was effective, and a randomized controlled trial is a very solid way to show that. But we also wanted to learn about what happens as a result of deployment, so how deployment affects families over time. And our families were, I would say they were pretty classic Minnesota National Guard and Reserve families. They had to have a child between the ages of 5 and 12, so they were a little older. They were very solidly middle-class families. Unfortunately, the Minnesota National Guard doesn't have a very, very diverse population, as you, I bet, can imagine. And they'd been married. I mean, they were pretty stable families, 10 years married, 1.2 kids. 1.2 marriages, I should say. 2.3 kids, 2.4 kids. And a range of deployments. What we were really pleased about was it wasn't just families where dad was deployed, mom was home. We had 57 mothers who deployed, and there is nothing known about deployed moms. And there are very few resources for deployed moms, and deployed moms have a really hard time. And I don't know if you recall, 7 or 8 years ago, there were some pieces on NPR about mothers being given their orders to deploy to war, and then while they were in Iraq or Afghanistan, these was often single mothers, having their children taken away from them because the mother was gone, abandoned their children. Horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Our judicial system has caught up a little bit, but mothers would often stop me would often tell us that people would stop them on the street. So they would say, well, to my husband, or the deployed moms who were married to deployed spouses, they would say to my husband, people in church or on the street would say to him, thank you for your service and your sacrifice. But when they stopped me on the street, they would say, how could you leave your children? So we were really glad to have data on both moms and dads who had deployed. So I'm going to fast forward. I'm not going to tell you a lot about our baseline data, but we have a lot of papers out, which I'm happy to share. But we wanted to, obviously, the first thing to know, before you can even tell whether a program's effective, is do people show up? And of the families who were randomized to the program, 75% came to at least one group session, which we were really pleased about. These are not families who are in trouble. These are families, this is a prevention sample, so these are families who have, typically don't have big problems at all. And an additional 10% of the families didn't come to the group, but they did use the online resources, so a total of 85% accessed some of the resources. And what was fantastic for us was that not only did most of the families attend at least half the session, but mums and dads came almost equally, which we knew we'd get mums, because most parenting programs pull in mums. It's really hard to pull in dads, as I'm sure you know. You also got mums and dads, which is fantastic. We had really good satisfaction. And it was hard, and I'll just say the limitation was for the online resources, it was pretty hard for us to get detailed descriptions of how much people use them, because if everyone goes online and you click a page, and so people would click onto one of the pages, say, to watch a video, but we even knew how long people stayed on the page, but of course that doesn't mean you're using the resource, right? Because I don't know about you guys, but I will leave my internet browser open for months on a particular page. So we did get good mindfulness use over the course of the study for the 271 group attendees. And what we found was that among the non-attendees to group, the mindfulness attendance kind of dropped off, so they would use the mindfulness exercises mostly in the first 4 weeks. So that's just a little bit about the exercise. And the exercises were short dose exercises. Those of you who are familiar with mindfulness-based stress reduction, for example, this was not mindfulness-based stress reduction where your sessions are 2.5 hours long and your exercises, your homework is 45 minutes a day of mindfulness practice. These were anything from a 30-second, take 10 deep breaths exercise to I would say the longest was a 30-minute exercise that really sort of a guided meditation. And we included yoga. We had 2 sessions of yoga, which we put on videotape so parents could go home and do yoga with their kids. Those were the favorite ones, I think. We evaluated the effectiveness of the program at 6, 12, and 24 months after baseline. So all participants were assessed at baseline, and then again, and then at 6 months post-baseline, which was roughly the end of the program for the people who did the program, we asked parents questions. We had online questionnaires that we gave to parents. And then 6 months later, at 12 months, we went back into people's homes, and we asked kids, parents, and teachers questions, and we did the same at 2 years. So we used what we call an intent-to-treat analysis, which is, we call it once randomized, always analyzed. So all the people who, flip of a coin, were assigned to the program group, whether or not they even showed up once, were compared with all the people who were randomized into the services as usual group. And the reason we do that, and we don't just include the people who show up, is because it could be that the people who show up are the more motivated people, and they'll change anyway. Doesn't matter what you give them. So really, it's a conservative and it's a gold standard test for comparing a program, but it does in fact mean that, you don't expect actually for there to be an effect on people who don't show up. So the effect for the people who do show up has to be a little bit stronger. So we looked at parenting efficacy. We looked at parent reports of ineffective discipline, but we didn't rely on what parents told us. We observed their parenting using the same coding that Marion talked about and with coders who are blind to study condition. We asked parents about their emotion regulation, mindfulness, and avoidance symptoms. And of course, we looked at psychopathology of both kids and parents. In child outcomes, we were interested in looking both at adaptive skills and at behavior problems, not just relying on what parents or their kids told us, but also teachers. And so I've got a few beautiful pictures for you, but don't worry about it. So these are SEM, structural equation models, and this is what we looked, these were from our analyses of 1 year post-baseline, so about 6 to 8 months after people had finished the program. And what we did was we compared people who were assigned to the intervention, were assigned to the program with those who didn't, and that's that little box on the top called ADAPT ITT, intent to treat. And we controlled for things like the number and length of deployments, the length of time, and whether you were married and how long you were married, and whether your child was a boy or a girl. And of course, we controlled for your parenting at baseline. And what we found was, and that's denoted by the 2 stars and the 0.16, that being assigned to the program group was associated with a significant increase in positive, effective parenting at 12 months, which means that ADAPT caused improvements in observed parenting, not what parents told us, but what we observed. I should say not just what parents told us. And then, this is really nasty, then we extended it a little bit more because the reason you want to see changes in parenting is because you want kids to be more resilient, right? You want to see improvements in kids' adjustment. And so that box, that circle on the right is a composite, it's a latent variable of what kids and sorry, this is just adult. Oh, it should say, okay, put the wrong one up there. But that's adult report of child adjustment. We actually subsequently did a latent variable that includes children and parents and teachers. And indeed, improvements in parenting were associated with significant improvements in kids' adjustment at 1 year. So we were really pleased and quite relieved about that. We also found, interestingly, we didn't predict this, that the ADAPT program significantly reduced mums' PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms at 12 months, but not dads, moms. There were indirect effects from mom to dad. So as I'm sure you know, when people live in the same family, they affect each other, their behavior affects each other. And some of our students and postdocs are really interested in understanding what happens between moms and dads in families, in two-parent families where there's some trauma and post-traumatic stress going on. And then we were asked by some colleagues to investigate how whether ADAPT might affect parents' psychopathology, in particular suicidality. And many of you know that suicidality is a very, very big problem in the US military. Unfortunately, it's just a terrible scourge. And some colleagues were interested in learning about programs that hadn't targeted suicidality. We did not target suicidality, and whether they had effects. So we looked at our data, and we really had we had very, very little. I think we had like one item on suicidality as part of a larger depression measure. But what we in fact found was that the program improved parents' efficacy, the way they thought about their own parenting. And that put in place a whole cascade of changes: reductions in anxiety, reductions in depression, reductions in PTSD symptoms, and reductions in suicidality of parents at 12 months. And so these improvements at 12 months were mediated by improvements in efficacy. And if you think about how if something makes you feel better about yourself, it's not surprising that it would make you mentally healthier, right? It would help you feel less hope. Think about depression makes you feel less hopeless if you feel you can do something, especially something as important as being your kid's best teacher. Our moms practice mindfulness more than our dads. But what we found was that within the group of people who were assigned to intervention, those people who practiced mindfulness more actually reported being more mindful, which is a good thing. So even those tiny, and the reason we didn't assume that was because they were very short dose exercises. But in fact, and my student Na Zhang is just publishing that paper in the journal Mindfulness. And her next paper is about emotion coaching. And actually what we found was that ADAPT improved mums' emotion coaching, but not dads at post-test. So we have these really interesting findings where we see more improvements in mums than in dads, and we're wondering about that. And I'll just say that one of the hypotheses that we're working on that we need to sort of do a little bit more examination of the data to find out is that dads don't get as much practice in parenting as mums do, particularly deployed dads. Because when they come home, first of all, if you're an avoidant dad, if you have some PTSD symptoms, then home is not where you want to be when kids are loud and noisy and there's conflict and stuff like that. And dads also can find it hard to come back into the home. And I'm going to show you an interview. Tell me when I have 5 minutes. 10, okay. And I'm going to show you an interview with a dad that I think really says that so powerfully. And this goes back to my colleague Jim Snyder, who got some independent funding to re-examine our observational data and did an absolutely stunningly beautiful job of it. So he was really interested to see, and no one's done this, how does PTSD, what do you see when you watch a dad with PTSD interact with his kids? So how does PTSD impact what you observe in parent-child interactions? And he proposed this idea. He thought that there would be four main ways, actually three, he thought. 3 main ways in which dads would be different with their kids if they had different levels of PTSD. He thought there might be less positive engagement with kids, which is not surprising, that there might be more reactivity coercion, so quicker escalation to negative interactions, and also more what he called withdrawal avoidance. So any of you who know PTSD know avoidance is a big thing. These dads would just probably withdraw more from their kids. But when he looked at the data, he found that there were all these items that he predicted would fall in one of these bins that didn't fall in one of these bins. They fell in their own bin. And he called this distress avoidance. And actually, it's a remarkable kind of construct. And basically, it refers to a dad who, when his child expresses distress, tries really hard to do what he thinks he should do, which is say to the kid, there, it's going to be okay. But it's so uncomfortable for dad to have to do that, because seeing his child upset or mad or withdrawn is so distressing that he quickly needs to push it under the carpet. And so it's really a rapid kind of, there, it's okay. Why don't we play a game? And it's very visibly distressing for dads. And that kind of behavior was really significantly associated with less positive engagement and self-reportive experiential avoidance, which is this core component of PTSD. But what he found over time was, and Jim looked at our 2-year data, he only had half our sample, just the 2-parent families where the dads were deployed and the mums weren't, just for sort of a clean cut of really, families who were in the same situations in that sense, that he found that those dads who reported high experiential avoidance at baseline, right? So think about it as more PTSD symptoms, but particularly in the avoidance area. Those high-risk dads were the ones who benefited most from the program. And the way they benefited was that 2 years later, those dads, when they were interacting with their kids, showed far less distress avoidance. They knew what to do. They were able to sit with their kids' negative emotions much more than the dads who didn't go through the program. So that's sort of one of the clues that says to us, for dads, there's probably a delayed effect. It takes time. Dads probably need a little bit more time to get these underway. And there are so many things that we haven't figured out, like what are the processes by which this happens? This process unfolds. So basically, what we're able to see from our analyses is that the program improves self-efficacy in parenting, both reports of ineffective discipline, mom's emotion coaching, observed parenting at 12 months, that's couple parenting, mom and dad together. That in turn leads to improvements in kids' emotional and behavioral adjustment, and that the improvements in efficacy also lead to reductions, or think about it as improvements in parents' own well-being, i.e. reductions in suicidality, PTSD, and depression. And that in these high-risk dads at baseline, we see less avoidance of distressing interactions with their kids, which is fabulous. So I'm going to show you this dad. Shawn wanted his name to be known, and he's actually a dad from Michigan who went through our most recent ADAPT study that's still underway. And at the end of the program, Shawn asked us if he could share his experiences with the program, about the program, and we said, with other people, and we're like, are you kidding? So this is Shawn, and he's interviewed here by Trevor over Skype, so that's why it's a little fuzzy.
Well, my name is Shawn Michaels. I served for 10 years in the United States Marine Corps. I was infantry and a combat engineer. I served in Iraq in the extended tour from 2003 until 2005. Some of the greatest things that I got out of the Adapt for You program was just the realization that really my legacy is my son and my family, not really the missions that I had in Iraq or Afghanistan or even in the Marines in general, that now is the time to, find happiness in my life. And they showed me that to listen to my son, which was a strange thing, I guess, for me. I just looked, I kind of almost as an obstacle, something I had to do. I look at it today like I get to be a father. I don't have to. And that's thanks to the program, because they said find a thing and make it every day. So I meet my son at a tree outside of his school every day, and we take the long way home. And I just listen to him talk. He's so intelligent, and he has range of emotions. And I fell in love with my son again. I know that sounds kind of weird, at least coming out of my mouth, but it's true. I found that when my home life was good, that I could do anything outside of the house. My anxieties went down. I stopped taking a lot of the prescription medications as doctors ordered. I didn't just stop, but I didn't need them anymore. I felt like I had a strong core. I was communicating with my wife if I had an issue. We would sit down every night and have an hour of discussion on just where we were at. And before it was like two separate people living under the same roof, and she was dealing with me, and I was just trying to survive on life's terms. I didn't want to. To be completely honest, this program has turned my whole life around 180%. For anyone looking to try something, when you feel a little lost, when you have a home life but you just don't know if you want to go home, when you're having issues with your wife, when things are a constant fight, they have tools in here, and formulas that make sense. You just follow that and you make it your own, and they work. Incentive charts that have children wanting to do chores, and it's strange when your wife sees you take control and be a father. She has this different kind of a trust and a love for you, and it develops a home life that I wouldn't give up for anything in the world. It's made my life worth living today.
What Shawn doesn't tell you in this video is the incredibly traumatic experiences that he had as a soldier in Afghanistan and Iraq, and his involvement in some really terrible, awful experiences. I just was going to do a quick show and tell. It's kind of hard after that. Of our formats and our strategies to engage families. We recognize that not everyone can come to a group. And so we developed and tested an online version of ADAPT called ADAPT Online, which has the program or the videos that you've seen, as well as practice videos and online chat available. And by the way, if people are interested, if you're interested, just shoot us an email. And we want to make, if you work with military families, we be happy to make the online program available. And this is the kind of the format that Shawn went through. It's what we call Telehealth, and some of you may practice Telehealth, but he was on the phone. This is Nick, one of our facilitators, but with Thad, another one. But Shawn would get on Skype. He would get on WebEx once a week with his facilitator Adriana and do this work. And then this is just a screenshot of our online program. And one of the things we're really finding, and is so consistent with our emphasis on emotions, is that our families are incredibly intentional. And what we do in session 1 is we really start with parenting values. And we help parents derive their values by doing an exercise where they're asked to imagine that their children, that they get to the ripe age of 70, and their children plan a birthday party for them. And at that 70th birthday party, their children stand up and talk about what their parents have taught them, the good things that their parents have taught them, and they derive their parenting values from that. And that sort of moves us into developing goals, parenting goals, etc. I mentioned the Mindfulness App, so that's just a screenshot, and Na and her colleagues developed that, and we're looking at that now. And then I mentioned that we have a SMART trial, a new trial, which we call our SMART trial, which stands for Sequential Multiple Assignment Randomized Trial, which is a hard name, but it's basically an attempt to understand what works for whom, under what circumstances. And in that study, we're going to be working with over 600 families in 3 big installations around the country, special operations families and regular Army families. So those are all our references, and I really want to acknowledge our incredible team. This is last year's photo, but it takes a village, this kind of work. So I want to say thank you. Thanks to them. And we have time. For everyone? Yeah. So I think we have time for questions, and what I'd like to do is open up to questions not only for me, but for Marion and for Bravada. So do I give away this mic, or do we have mics?
Yeah, you can use it. Yeah.
I'll use the handheld, give you this one. Okay. So questions, comments, thoughts for anyone? Please.
I just want to say thank you on behalf of families that have children. You know, with families in the military, and I had sons who were deployed in Iraq, Afghanistan, Africa, and I worked with a lot of families as a parent educator, helping those families cope with it. And I really want to stress that reintegration piece that you were talking about, and how absolutely important it is, because they've been strangers for so long, and to bring them back together. So thank you for your service.
Well, thank you for your service, and we know that when one member of the family serves, the whole family serves. Thank you.
Hi, Abby. This question is for you. The emotion coaching part of ADAPT, what did that involve? Did you
Sorry,
hear me?
Tabitha, you asked about a part of ADAPT, but...
The emotion coaching part.
Emotion coaching, thank you. So great question, because I didn't really have much time to talk about it. And I wanted to show you the emotion coaching video, but it's 10 minutes long, and I knew that would push us over the edge. So basically, emotion coaching is a concept that was developed by John Gottman originally. Some of you may know his work. And it sort of really teaches parents how to respond to their kids, not just their kids' behaviors, but their kids' emotions. So the classic example, and we do that really it's a sophisticated skill. It's the hardest skill for our parents. I think it's the hardest, as a parent, it's the hardest skill for me. And so basically, if you take the situation that I gave where a child is very, very anxious, and often our parents tell us this all the time. When my husband was deployed, they say, my kid came to sleep in my bed every night, and kind of that was comforting for me too. But now my husband's back, he kicked our kid out of the bed, but my kid still wakes up in the middle of the night, and we have a really hard time getting him to sleep. And my husband says, oh, you shouldn't be scared, I'm back, I'm safe, it's all okay, right? But we know that that's not what happens. And so how do parents respond very concretely to an incident like that? And so there's several steps around emotion coaching, but the idea here is, the first thing is to help parents be able to tolerate the emotion, right? And that requires helping themselves identify what their emotion is when their child runs into the room screaming and wakes them up in the middle of the night, learning to regulate that emotion, and then helping the child, not in the middle of the night, let me just say, but helping the child at the right time to identify that emotion in them, right? So we sit down, we'll role play a parent and child sitting down, and the child came off the school bus and was bullied, or it was upset, and they sit down and the mom might ask the child, so what were you feeling? I don't know. Okay, well, where were you feeling it in your body? And so we help parents help their kids create an emotion vocabulary that relates not just to the name, but also where you feel it in your body and what it does to you. And then what do you do about it, right? So a lot of our parents, military service members, military families are amazing problem solvers. They are incredible at solving problems. Now, there's a downside to that, which is you want to solve the problem immediately, right? And often with an emotional problem, it's like, there's nothing to worry about, there's no monsters here, go back to bed. Which is easier for parents to tolerate because it's kind of hard to delve in. So it's helping parents be able to tolerate and then spend time discussing emotions, which sometimes I think at the beginning make people feel like it's a waste of time.
discussing emotions, but when they do it and they practice it and they experience it themselves, they realize, oh, okay. And so we show examples. So Gottman identified several sort of opposites of emotion coaching. So things like punishing or invalidating or dismissing emotions. So all of you have heard, don't cry, big boys don't cry, right? That's an example, right, of really sort of, invalidating the kids crying, big boys don't cry. Or I've heard this once or twice, if you don't beat that kid up, I'm going to beat you up. Those kinds of things. So it's an attempt to sort of rethink about how we respond to emotions, and to coach parents to coach their kids. So. Any other questions for any of us?
Hi. I was just wondering, is this program an ongoing thing that current military families are able to take part in, or is this a study that was done and it's over?
I'm having a really hard time hearing. You said, is this program ongoing?
Yes. Or is it just something that you did for the study, and then can they still take part in this program?
Yes, it is ongoing. So we have 4 studies that are either finished or underway. But in addition, the Minnesota National Guard recently, the Adjutant General, General Nash, who was an incredible supporter of the program, just retired, said that he wants the program available to every National Guard family in Minnesota, and we're working on that. So obviously the first step is to get funding to do that. The Department of Defense, the Undersecretary's Office for the Office of Military, Family and Community Policy, and the Undersecretary of Defense's office are actually trying to change the way contracts are done in the military so that they can have their military family life consultants deliver the program. So we're very excited about that. But these things take a really long time. So Marion talked about implementation. So we're kind of sort of in the middle of validation. So we've validated the program. Now we're validating different types and formats of the program. And we're just at the very beginning, like we're pre-beginning of implementation. So I expect it's going to take a while. But yes, our goal is to give it away, to make sure that everyone's who needs it, who wants it, can have it.
Just wanted to ask, has your program and this research measured outcomes for families where a deployed parent had a TBI?
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Oh, I'm sorry. Has your research measured outcomes for families where a deployed parent has a traumatic brain injury?
Oh, great question. So the question is, have we looked at outcomes in families where both parents, is it one parent or both parents have a traumatic brain injury, or anyone has a traumatic brain injury? So you obviously are familiar with this, but traumatic brain injury has been called the signature disorder of these wars, because there are so many service members. So first of all, our military medicine is remarkable and saves many more lives than were ever able to be saved in previous wars, because battlefield medicine is so good. But they're also, this is not a conventional war, and so many of the injuries are from improvised explosive devices which shake around. I mean, even if you're in a Hummer, if you roll over an IED, then your brain is shaken inside your head. And that's very highly comorbid with PTSD as well, and often people who have mild traumatic brain injury don't even get diagnosed. It's very difficult. So the short answer is we do have some crude measures of TBI. We ask people, but we don't do any official measures. But we have a very close colleague at the VA, Melissa Poluzny, who's been doing the longest running study of resiliency National Guard soldiers, RINGS. And we figure we have a very big overlap of people, and so we're working on a joint proposal that will allow us to examine exactly what you're saying. So what are the outcomes in specific subpopulations? So we measure PTSD, and we know that 15% of our group are above the clinical threshold. This is the guys for PTSD. And we looked at that, but we have not looked at TBI yet. We hope to. Yeah. Any other questions?
Hi. I am Hallie, and I'm here with my colleague from Durham, North Carolina, actually. So we are very far away from home, but very comforted by the fact that so many of the issues discussed today are so relevant for us as well. So I think that mostly my question is Dr. B, because we have just been trained in the PMTO PTC model, so we'll very soon be starting parent groups in North Carolina. And as of recently, we are going to be 2 white women presenting to a room of mostly black parents with black children. And in Durham recently, we had to close our clinic because we got word of a Klan rally nearby. So race issues are, very, very relevant in our work as well. And so I'm wondering if you just have any brief thoughts on how we walk into this group being young white women serving black parents and the issues that are unique in this context.
Wow. I think one of the first things I would say is when you go in there, acknowledge you're white. I mean, I think that helps. So when you come with that and you say, I know I'm white, and I know that what I see out there are injustices, oppression. I have privilege because I'm white. And in this room, you have to experience it without having privilege. How can we work on empowering you, supporting you, helping you to parent in a world that says your children shouldn't exist? If you come in that kind of spirit, you'll almost hear a sigh of relief in the room because they're waiting for someone to have that cultural courage to talk about that issue. Right now I'm writing a book called When I Say Race, People Run. Because nobody wants to talk about it. So when you come head on, it really creates an environment of safety. They're waiting to have somebody say it beside them. Does that help? Okay.
We have time for one more. Right here, Kate.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I'm a physician, and there's a lot of talk recently about suicide within our profession and physician burnout. And I think that, clearly when you have people working really highly intense hours and getting little sleep and being exposed to trauma, secondary trauma, you're going to get some of these symptoms in the parents as well. Have you ever thought about elaborating this model into care for physicians or providers?
So I thank you for sort of raising the issue of secondary traumatic stress, which is a huge issue around for providers, sometimes parents, secondary traumatic stress in spouses of service members and their kids. So I think thank you for raising it. It's a really important issue. So we're really fortunate to be members of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And there are a lot of resources around secondary traumatic stress. I think I want to, I just want to make the disclaimer that this is not a suicide prevention model. It's not a suicide prevention program. And it sort of raises the issue of what we call crossover effects, which refer to the fact that you can, in our science, we want to be very, very precise. We're targeting this so that we get that. But actually what we find is we get that. all sorts of things. Marion talked about cascading effects over more than over 9 years and more. So that's how we got these. So I think, so the short answer is I believe we should support, and particularly physicians. I put like physicians with cops, right? Your front line, you're seeing particularly the emergency physicians and people who are, doing the sort of high intensity work. You're at the front lines just like, our cops are at the front lines. And often there's sort of this idea that it's the same stigma about mental health. I don't even know, it might even be worse in physicians, I don't know, but certainly, drink your sorrows away, don't go to the department, shrink. So I think one of the issues that sort of addresses that is the issue of destigmatizing mental health issues that lead to suicidality, and also institutionalizing prevention programs. So I'm a prevention scientist because I don't believe that we should have anyone coming for treatment because I think we should be able to address their problems before they have to come into treatment. So, yeah. And I'm happy to talk after if you want more.